Late in the evening of March 25, 2021, Seoul police broke down the door of an apartment in Nowon-gu. Inside, it was pitch dark, the curtains drawn tight, and the air was thick with a smell everyone present that day understood right. The lights came on. Inside the apartment were 3 bodies, a middle-aged woman and 2 young women whom the examination later determined had died about 2 days early. But what made the officers freeze wasn't those 3 bodies. There was a 4th person in the apartment, and that person was alive, a man in his early 20s. On his neck, stomach, and wrists were wounds, but none of them were deep. The refrigerator door was ajar, not fully closed. On the table, a half-eaten bowl of rice, an empty milk carton, and in the trash, a few empty beer. The 3 had been dead for 2 days, their bodies still lying right there in the home. And for those 2 whole days, someone had been eating drink. Hello. We often think kindness is something safe, that if we treat others with goodwill, the worst that can happen is that goodwill simply isn't returned, and that kindness, even if wasted, never comes back to harm the person who gave it. But there are cases where the most ordinary friendly gesture, the kind of thing any of us does for a friend every day, falls into a mind that translates it into something else entirely. And from that moment on, the person who gave the kindness stepped into a story they never even knew they were part of. The case we're talking about today is one of the most shocking in South Korea in the past 2 decades, when 3 women from the same family lost their lives within just 6 hours. A petition demanding the killer's identity be made public gathered 250,000 signatures in under a week, forcing South Korean authorities to do something they rarely do. And a law that had sat waiting in the National Assembly for 22 years was finally passed exactly 1 day after the... Who was the man still alive in that apartment? Why did he stay instead of running? And what turned a chance acquaintance made through a video game into an ending like this? Let's turn back the clock to November 2020, the moment everything began with something completely ordinary. But first, let's go back to the evening the police arrived. Around 8 in the evening on March 25, 2021, the local police station received a call from a young woman saying her friend, Ms. Park, had been unreachable for 2 days. Calls went unanswered, texts went unanswered, and her social media accounts had gone completely silent. To be fair, a woman in her 20s losing contact for 2 days isn't exactly unusual. But this friend knew something outsiders didn't, that Ms. Park lived with her mother and younger sister, so she called all 3 of them, and all 3 at the same time were unreachable. Something felt wrong, so she called the police. Based on the address her friend provided, police quickly arrived at an apartment complex in Nowon district, knocked repeatedly with no answer, and decided to break the door down. What they saw inside was exactly what we described at the start of this video. At this point, the most natural reaction for anyone would be to think the surviving man was a lucky victim who'd escaped death because of the wounds on his body, his motionless posture at the scene. And the fact that the other 3 had died, every outward sign pointed to that conclusion. But details in the kitchen overturned the whole investigation. The fridge was open, food had been taken out, the milk was gone, the beer had been opened, and on the table sat an unfinished bowl of rice. This pointed to one fact. The man had been in the apartment for 2 full days, eating and sleeping normally, while 3 bodies lay just a few steps away. This is not the behavior of someone who had just narrowly escaped. So who was he, and what was his relationship to this family? To answer that, we first need to know who the people in that apartment were. The eldest daughter, Ms. Park, 25 years old, was an ordinary office worker. Her younger sister, 22, had just stepped into working life, and their mother, 59. The 2 girls' father had passed away 20 years earlier, and since then their mother had raised both daughters alone. The 3 of them relied on one another in a modest apartment. Nothing dramatic, not wealthy, not remarkable, just an utterly ordinary single-parent family in a big city, just like hundreds of thousands of others. Here I want to pause for a moment because there's a detail I think you should know. In all of the publicly released records, the sister and the mother weren't even referred to by name, only by their age and their relation to the eldest sister. Meanwhile, the name that appeared everywhere in the press for more than a year afterward was the killer's. This is something I think anyone telling stories like this should feel uneasy about. This channel has one rule: the victim is who deserves to be remembered. So before we go on, I hope you'll remember these three women. A 59-year-old mother who carried her family alone for 20 years. A 25-year-old eldest daughter working an office job like so many other young people. And a 22-year-old younger sister who had only just stepped into adult life. Three people who truly lived, not three numbers in a case file. As for the man in the apartment, his name was Kim Tae-hyun, 24 years old, living in Gangnam District. Notice this geographic detail because Gangnam and Nowon sit on opposite sides of Seoul. So what was someone living in Gangnam doing in an apartment in Nowon? In his first statements, he told police that he and Ms. Park had a romantic dispute. And when police went to people who knew him to verify that relationship, they found he'd told everyone the exact same line. The phrase romantic dispute at the moment the case first broke almost entirely shaped how the public saw the whole thing. Hearing that phrase, people immediately pictured a familiar script. The two of them must have had something going on. Maybe they dated. Maybe there'd been something unspoken between them. Then it fell apart and the man, unwilling to accept it, wouldn't let. That was the most natural, most intuitive assumption. But when police reached out to Ms. Park's friends, their reactions were strikingly uniform. They all said Ms. Park never had a boyfriend, so where did this romantic dispute even come from? The two sides' accounts didn't match at all. So what was the truth, and why was he even inside Ms. Park's home? It all started with a video game. Around November 2020, he met Ms. Park through the game League of Legends. Anyone who's played it knows it's a team-based game. Teammates constantly have to communicate and coordinate. Playing well together builds familiarity, and familiarity. The two exchanged contact info and occasionally called each other. There were times he told Ms. Park things weren't going well for him lately. Lots of pressure, feeling down, and Ms. Park offered to Ms. Park this was so ordinary it wasn't even worth mentioning because everyone around her later said the same thing. She treated everyone that way. But not him. He believed Ms. Park had feelings for him, and this right here is where the entire tragedy began. One person believed something had started between them, while the other believed she was simply doing what any normal friend would do. Two people understood the very same relationship in two completely different ways, right from the very... In January 2021, the two met in person for the first time at an internet cafe after a round of gaming. The second time was also gaming, followed by a casual meal together. And the third time was a gathering of 4 people, including Ms. Parkim and 2 mutual friends they knew from the game. At first, the mood at that meal was fairly cheerful, the young people laughing and talking about the game, about their lives, a perfectly ordinary meal. But partway through, Ms. Park was chatting with another male friend at the table, the two of them joking around a little. Exactly the kind of normal interaction between friends and... except him. Watching that scene, his expression changed instantly. There was only one reason he got angry, and it was absurd to the point of being hard to believe. Ms. Park had shown someone else the exact same... She used to smile at him. Now she smiled at someone else too. Just because of that, he started picking a fight, making the mood at the meal deeply uncomfortable, and it ended in irritation. After the meal broke up, something happened. Ms. Park and everyone else who'd been there that day all blocked him at once. This wasn't Ms. Park's decision alone, but a unanimous reaction from everyone at the table because they all felt something was off about him. Honestly, for most of us, being blocked by someone you'd only just met, after just 3 meetings, wouldn't even qualify as heartbreak at most. It's just an unpleasant social encounter. A few days of annoyance, then it's over. But he wasn't most of us. He didn't accept that outcome. And it wasn't just non-acceptance, because inside his head, an entirely different logic system. Later on, during questioning, police asked him a very direct question. What exactly was your relationship with Mrs. Park? He answered, a potential girlfriend. When police asked what he meant by potential girlfriend and what he based that on, he gave exactly 3 pieces of evidence. First, on his birthday, Ms. Park gave him a culture gift card. Second, the two of them had once had drinks alone together. Third, one time when he was upset and crying, Ms. Park had held his hand to comfort him. Having said that, he turned the question back on the police if that's not a romantic relationship. Then the police replied that friends do those things too, didn't he know that? And he answered, we're not like that. But everything police gathered from Ms. Park's acquaintances showed she treated everyone the same way. This showed the problem wasn't in Ms. Park's behavior, but in the decoding system inside his head, where a gift card meant a confession of love. Sharing drinks once meant dating, and holding his hand meant a relationship had been established. The friendliness Ms. Park showed everyone had been translated by him into a signal meant only for him. In his mind, Ms. Park already belonged to him. Police later verified through multiple sources and confirmed one fact: there had never been any romantic relationship between Ms. Park and him, and from beginning to end, the entire relationship existed, and now that person had just been blocked. For a normal person, being blocked is annoying, but it ends there and each person moves on. But in his world, this was called betrayal. In his statement, he said, she cut off contact, wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't meet with me, and I felt betrayed. As time passed, his resentment and anger only grew. And from the very moment he was blocked, he began to act. The first thing he did was try to get Ms. Park's home address, but the problem was every normal channel of contact had been completely cut off. Her phone number was blocked, her social media accounts were locked, and he couldn't reach her. He didn't give up. Instead, he dug up the entire chat history he'd had with Mrs. Park and read through it all again. Then he found a screenshot. The two had apparently once talked about buying something online, and Ms. Park had casually taken a screenshot of the delivery details and sent it over but on that image was one piece of critical information: the delivery address. In late January 2021, about 2 weeks after being blocked, he showed up near Misty Park's home for the first time, and that day he stood waiting in the building's lobby for nearly 8 hours, from 2 in the afternoon until 9:30 at night, until Ms. Park came home and the two of them crossed paths. Seeing him, Ms. Park didn't hedge and didn't hold back. She told him flatly to never come looking for her again and never contact her again. There was nothing left to say between. Put that plainly, her attitude couldn't have been any clearer, and anyone with an ordinary grasp of language, no matter how upset they might feel inside, would understand that this was the end of it. But he didn't stop. From that day on, he began showing up regularly around Ms. Park's home, coming back every few days. When Ms. Park blocked his number, he called from public phones. When she wouldn't answer unknown numbers, he borrowed other people's phones to text. When she didn't reply to messages, he'd go wait outside her building. Ms. Park confided in friends that she'd run out of options and had to change her phone number entirely. And every time she went home, she had to take a long detour, standing far off to watch, first confirming he wasn't in the lobby before. Ms. Park gave him a nickname, Black Life Vest, because every time he showed up, he wore that same black life vest. There was one time she couldn't take it anymore and screamed a question right in his face: why on earth are you doing this to me? She also warned him very clearly that if he kept it up, she would call the police, but he completely ignored that. At this point, I want to pause for a moment. Let's go back and check everything Ms. Park did to try to protect herself. First, she blocked all contact. Second, she refused him to. His face told him directly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Third, she changed her phone number. Fourth, she changed her entire commuting route. detouring and watching every single day before going, and fifth, she warned him she'd report him to the police. In other words, she did almost everything a person could possibly do in that situation. If it were you in that position, what would you have done next? The most obvious question is, why didn't Ms. Park just go to the police? And this is the most maddening part of this entire case. In March 2021 in South Korea, stalking and harassment were still classified as a minor administrative offense. Suppose Ms. Park really had gone to the police, suppose the police had taken the report, suppose there was ample evidence and the whole process played out. The harshest penalty a stalker could face was still just a fine of 100,000 won converted. That's less than 2,000. This is exactly why Ms. Park's warning meant nothing to him, because both of them knew there was almost nothing behind that warning. And so it went from late January until right before the case occurred. For nearly 2 months, he never let go of the relationship he'd built entirely inside his own head, and the anger from being rejected didn't fade at all. It kept fermenting gradually, transforming into something far more. He began gathering information. He came to know this family's entire daily routine like the back of his hand: who left the house and at what time, who came home and at what time, which hours the apartment was empty, which hours only one person was there, and which internet cafe Ms. Park used. He spent 2 full months learning it all. Before making his move, he confirmed one last thing: Ms. Park's days off. He dug up a secondary game account he never used, changed the username, disguised himself as a completely unfamiliar player Ms. Park had never met. Then first he made up an excuse to play a match together, to strike up a conversation, going back and forth a few times to slowly build a baseline of trust. Then in one casual chat he asked, as if it were nothing, "When are your days off?" Ms. Park, completely unguarded around a stranger in the game, answered the 24th and 25th of March. Just that one line, and he had the final piece of information he needed. He chose March 23rd to make his move. Why that exact date? Because the 2 days right after that were Ms. Park's days off. She wouldn't have to go to work. No coworker would notice her absence and get suspicious. And that gap gave him 2 days. Remember that number. March 23rd, 2021. Before leaving home, he opened his phone, went to a search engine, and typed in a few keywords roughly about methods of committing a crime and vulnerable points on the human body. 5 p.m., 6 hours left. He showed up at an internet cafe near Ms. Park's home, the exact one he'd scoped out many times before, and the cameras captured his entire. He pushed the door open, found a seat, but didn't turn on the computer. Sat a while, then to the restroom. Came out, sat a while longer. About 13 minutes later, he stood up and left. Ms. Park wasn't there, and he now knew what he needed to know. Cameras captured him leaving the internet cafe and heading toward Ms. Park's apartment building. Along the way, he turned into a nearby supermarket, stole a knife off a shelf, and hid it inside his jacket. Then picked up a bottle of water, paid for it in cash at the counter, acting like an ordinary customer, and walked. 5:30 in the afternoon. 6 hours left. He stood outside her apartment door. At that moment, Ms. Park was still at the office. Her mother was still at work too, and inside the apartment there was only. He rang the doorbell. She didn't open it, just called out through the door, "Who is it?" He said he was a delivery worker with an urgent package. She said, "Just leave it." He crouched down, pretending to set the package down, then turned and made a show of walking away, and the sound of footsteps rang out, fading into the distance. But after a few steps, he stopped. He didn't leave. He backed away to a spot further down the hallway, pressed his back against the wall and stood there, then took out the knife he'd just. Inside the apartment, the younger sister began to sense something was wrong, because she hadn't ordered anything. She called her mother, asking if there was any package she was expecting, and her mother said no. She texted her sister, who also said no. Both said there was no delivery. So what was this package? She opened the door. What happened after that, we won't describe. The forensic report later determined her cause of death was acute blood loss. That 22-year-old didn't even know the name of the man standing in front of her. She'd simply been home, and simply the one who opened it. In his plan, her death wasn't the goal, just an obstacle that needed clearing away, and that is perhaps the most brutal detail in this entire case. He didn't flee. He stayed waiting for the next person to come home, and while he waited, he did something. He picked up the younger sister's phone. The mother, after that call asking about her youngest daughter's package, felt a bit uneasy, so a few minutes later she texted asking if her daughter had... No reply. She texted again. "What are you doing?" Still no answer. He saw that message and he replied with a single word, "Yeah." But the youngest daughter, normally warm and affectionate in her texts, had never once replied with... During that stretch of time, the mother called 7 times and not one call was answered. 10:30 at night. 1 hour left. The mother pushed the door open, and he was already waiting behind it. That 59-year-old woman who had raised her 2 daughters alone for 20 years died right there in her own home. He kept waiting. 11:30 at night. Miss Park arrived home. Why was she so late? According to what her friends later said during that period, she always came home very late because she was taking detours and avoiding him, and every day after work she had to stand and watch from a distance, making sure the man in the black life vest wasn't in the lobby before she... That night there was no black life vest in the lobby at all. Because he wasn't in the lobby, he was already up in her apartment. Based on evidence at the scene and his own statements, police were able to reconstruct what happened. Miss Park opened the door. She saw him, saw the blood on his body, and saw the knife in his hand. She didn't scream. She asked what that knife was about and where her family was. He said, "I already took them away." She said, "Let's call an ambulance." He refused. She kept asking other questions, but he said nothing more, just stared at her in silence. The next thing he did was take her phone, cutting off her contact with the outside world. According to the police reconstruction, in that desperate state, Miss Park struggled and fought with him for over 20 minutes, after which the two of them got into a violent struggle and she fought back to the very end. But in the end, he killed her. 6 hours, 3 lives. A family whose mother had single-handedly held everything together for 20 years vanished. After killing Ms. Park, the first thing he did was not flee. He picked up her phone, opened the messaging app, found the conversation with their mutual friends, and scrolled up, reading through it. Looking for what? He was looking for what the people who'd blocked him had said about him behind his back, what they'd told Ms. Park about him, whether they'd cursed him, whether they'd mocked him, whether they'd talked about him where he... After reading it all, he blocked every one of them, then opened Ms. Park's other social media accounts, went into her friends list, and deleted them one by one, blocking everyone connected to him. In other words, he used a dead woman's phone to help the dead woman cut ties with those people. This is a detail I think reveals almost everything about who he is. Even after everything was over, the only thing he still cared about was his own image in other people's eyes. Once he'd finished all that, he got up and went into the kitchen, opened the fridge, drank the milk, and cracked open a beer. Then at some point during the night, he picked up the knife and injured himself, then passed out. He woke up the next afternoon, ate something, then did it again, and neither time was life-threatening. After that, he drifted in and out of consciousness until the evening of March 25th, when Ms. Park's friend called the police. Police broke down the door and found him lying right next to Ms. Park's body. He was taken to the hospital, and after he recovered on April 4th, police formally carried out the arrest warrant. He admitted to the entire crime. At this point, I want to pause for a second time. But this time it's not to ask which direction you'd take the investigation, because this case never needed an investigation. The killer was lying right. The question here is different. A man who spent 2 months stalking a young woman who stood waiting outside her home for 8 straight hours, who used public phones and borrowed other people's phones to reach her, who was rejected to his face, who was warned she'd call the police and still never stopped. So before January 2021, where had this person been? And was this really the first time he'd ever done? After the case broke, police conducted a full investigation into his background, and they discovered this was far from the first time. He was born in 1996. He had one sibling and was the elder brother. His parents divorced when he was young. After the divorce, he went with his mother, and the two of them moved into a semi-basement unit, and he dropped out after finishing high school and after completing his mandatory military service. He still couldn't find stable work living off short-term high. He once worked at an internet cafe, and the owner of that cafe, in a later interview, recalled seeing a young man who'd just finished his military service with nowhere to turn, and out of kindness gave him a job letting him work there with food, and later on the owner discovered he'd repeatedly stolen cash from the cafe, adding up to several 100,000 won, but thinking he was still young. But that still wasn't the end of it, because before this case happened, he already had 3 prior The first was in 2015, sending sexually offensive messages to a woman resulting in a fine of 300,000 won. The second was in 2019, sneaking into a women's restroom to spy on someone, resulting in a fine of 2,000. The third was in 2020, recording private audio of himself and repeatedly sending it to a woman to harass her, which also resulted in a fine of 2,000 won. 3 offenses, all 3 sexual in nature, and all 3 ended with just a fine. Not once was his physical freedom ever restricted. There's more. After the case became public, several witnesses came forward confirming he had a prior history of stalking and harassment. And it wasn't only aimed at women. One of the people he had once stalked was a young man surnamed Lee. When he first got close to Mr. Lee, he was only 19 and approached him posing as an older brother. At first, he was unbelievably good to Mr. Lee. How good was he? He bought Mr. Lee a smartphone and then paid the monthly bill for him every month, which made Mr. Lee simply believe this person genuinely cared about him, without thinking any further. But gradually, things began to sour. He started demanding that Mr. Lee reply to messages at any hour, report where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. If Mr. Lee didn't reply in time, he would fire off a barrage of accusatory messages. And if Mr. Lee refused to meet him, he would send 2 kinds of photos, one showing blood, and one showing a knife, along with a line, "If you report this to the police or tell anyone, I'll kill your whole family." Now let's pull out the entire timeline and look back over it as a whole. First, he used favors to bind the other person tightly to him, then used those very favors to establish control, and the moment the other person tried to break free, he'd switch straight into threat mode. Add to that the 3 prior convictions. And finally, this case, we see a very clear pattern of escalation from control to harassment, from harassment to intrusion, and from intrusion to murder. Each step more extreme than the last. After the case occurred, police had him undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and the conclusion was that he had full criminal responsibility. In simpler terms, every decision he made, from researching methods of committing the crime to stealing the knife, to scoping out the location, to disguising an account, to extract information, all the way to choosing the exact date to strike, all showed that his cognitive faculties were fully intact, and that he knew After the case, many criminal psychology experts published their own analyses. One of them, a criminal psychology professor at Kyunghee University, assessed that he displayed classic traits of paranoid personality disorder, whose core symptom is called delusion. Put simply, the brain of someone with this condition automatically rewrites reality into the version they want if you smile at them once. They believe you like them if you're cold toward them. They believe you're testing their feelings, and if you block them, they believe you've betrayed them. The most frightening thing about this type of person is that they genuinely believe the version inside their own head. So the more you explain that there's nothing between you, the more they believe you're hiding your feelings for. It's a completely self-contained, closed-loop system where outside information can never get in and the internal logic can never be broken. The professor also added that during this delusional process, he kept building up a growing conviction that he was actually the one being wronged until that conviction grew strong enough to drive him to commit the crime. On April 9, 2021, he was formally handed over to the prosecution. In front of reporters' cameras, he said one line, "I probably can't answer every one of your questions. I hope you'll understand." A reporter asked if he had anything to say to the victim's family, and he got down on his knees saying that every day he lived, even every breath he took, he felt profound guilt, while also offering an apology to everyone who had suffered because of him. A reporter asked if he could remove his mask, and he took it off right away without a moment's hesitation, then turned to face the cameras with a calm expression. On April 27, 2021, the prosecution charged him with 5 crimes: murder, theft, aggravated unlawful home invasion, violation of the Minor Offenses Punishment Act, and illegal network intrusion. In September 2021, the first trial opened and the prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense argued that while the defendant admitted the killing of Ms. Park was premeditated, the killing of the sister and mother was spontaneous. He himself argued along the same lines in court, saying that after he subdued the younger sister, she kept resisting and the noise was so loud he panicked, fearing the neighbors would notice, and laughed. But the prosecution immediately produced the record of his own initial statement during questioning, in which he had admitted, in his own words, that if he committed the crime at Ms. So the prosecution stated firmly that the deaths of the mother and the younger sister were absolutely not spontaneous or On October 12, 2021, the first instance court sentenced him to life in prison. The victim's family appealed and firmly demanded the death penalty. The defendant also appealed, and on January 19, 2022, the appellate court upheld the life sentence. When delivering the ruling, the judge said the sheer cruelty of this case gave more than sufficient grounds for a death sentence, and he acknowledged that this case truly deserved that sentence. But right after, he explained why the court wasn't handing it down, because South Korea had gone over 20 years without carrying out an execution, and international human rights organizations had classified South Korea. So the final sentence remained life imprisonment. On April 14, 2022, the Supreme Court rejected both sides' appeals and the life sentence was finalized. After the case became public, a petition demanding the killer's identity be released surpassed 250,000 signatures in under a week, and under that pressure, South Korean authorities took the rare step of public. And at the end of this story, there's one more thing well worth mentioning. South Korea has a law called the Act on Punishment of Stalking Crimes, first introduced to the National Assembly by a lawmaker back in Over the following 22 years, the bill kept getting proposed, then kept getting shelved. On March 24, 2021, that law was finally passed by the National Assembly. Pay close attention to that date. Exactly one day before the law was passed, that is, on March 23rd, the mother and her 2 daughters died in that apartment. If this law had been passed sooner, even just a month sooner than when she was being stalked, Ms. Park might have been able to report it to police, and police might have been able to issue a restraining order against him. But history has no what-ifs. The story ends here. But this case is different from most of the cases we've covered before, because what makes it so chilling isn't the brutality, it's how utterly ordinary everything about it was. The first thing I want to say is that Ms. Park did absolutely nothing. She simply treated an acquaintance exactly the way she treated all of her friends, with nothing more than basic kindness. She blocked contact, changed her number, took detours home, refused him to his face, and warned him, meaning she did everything within her power. It's just that the person she encountered happened to be someone who translated goodwill into romantic interest. The second point is about the gap a society left behind. All 3 convictions ended in just fines, and stalking itself was only punishable by a 100. Every single one of those was a chance to intervene, and every single one slipped by. This points to a simple reality. When the cost of an act is so cheap that people no longer fear it, a victim's warning carries no weight at all. And the third point, also the most practical thing I want to leave you with. If you're ever unfortunate enough to encounter someone who fixates on you like this, please learn to recognize the warning signs early. Someone who constantly demands to know where you are and what you're doing. Someone who systematically misreads your ordinary gesture. When you notice signs like these, don't try to handle it alone. And don't be afraid to trouble other people. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your workplace, and when necessary, report it to the police. Keeping yourself safe always matters more than anything else, more than any worry about being seen as overreacting. The 3 women in that apartment in Nowon district never got the protection of that law simply because they lived exactly. That's it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.